What are components of good internal control? Well, you need written policies and procedures. Employees need to have a policy and procedures manual that they can read that tells them exactly what the company policy is on how they should carry out their jobs and what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior. Each transaction needs to have an individual who is authorized to perform that transaction and is given the responsibility to carry it out. This also may involve approval of a superior. So individuals should not be performing tasks for which they're not authorized. Documentation. You need good documentation for each financial transaction that's recorded. If a check is issued, you need to have documentation to support that issuance. If an item is received from a vendor, you need to have documentation before you pay that. You need to send out documentation to your customers, telling them how much they owe you for a particular transaction. Reconciliations. We learned about reconciling bank accounts and how important they are, but there are other accounts that need to be reconciled. For example, we need to reconcile the detail of our accounts receivable to the total of accounts receivable in our general ledger. The same with accounts payable. We have to make sure that the individual customer accounts balance to the total, or the individual vendor accounts balance to the total. You need security. In other words, who can get into certain levels of your programs on your computer. If they have no reason to be there, then the security should be in place to block them out. They should only be given access on a need-know basis. Access to the physical facilities. When can a person have access to the facility? And how do they get authority to do that? It may be that you can allow people in your office after office hours, but there should be certain parameters in place permitting them to do that, and there should be something available that tells them when they entered the building and when they left and who they were. Warehouses should have strong security on them, so someone cannot come from the outside through the back door and steal goods and services from you. I would say the most important part of security today deals with the area of computers and access to data. Segregation of duties. Transactions should be separated between different individuals, so no single individual has the control over an entire transaction. Here's an example. The person who receives cash and opens the mail should not be the person that records the cash or checks in the customer's account. And the person who records the checks in the customer's account should not be the person who makes the bank deposit. The person who authorizes the payroll should not be the same person who prepares the payroll. The person who writes checks should not be the person who reconciles the bank account. You can have segregation of duties even in small businesses where you have maybe 2 or 3 people working in the office. You just have to get past the concept of this is an accounts payable clerk, or this is an accounts receivable clerk, or this is a cashier. You need to separate those duties out among the 3 people in the office. So they may do something on receivables, something on handling cash, something on handling payroll, something on handling vendor accounts. But they don't have complete control of that entire transaction. And the last thing you need to do is have somebody preparing checks and also signing them. How do you create ethical behavior in a firm? Well, it starts with management. If management are not ethical, then none of the subordinates are going to be ethical. If subordinates see unethical behavior on the part of management, they're going to act the same. When you look at your major frauds of corporations, you'll find that in most cases, management was acting in an unethical behavior, and their unethical behavior was obvious to some of their subordinates, who acted then in a similar fashion. So it starts with management. You need a published code of ethics. What is acceptable in this company and what is not acceptable, and the consequences of not being ethical. Employee awareness. Talk about fraud and ethical behavior at staff meetings. Make people aware that if a fraud has occurred, how it happened and what it was and what the consequences were. Put controls in place. In other words, the controls that were spoken about in the previous slide. Put those in place. If you have good controls in place, then you're going to reinforce ethical behavior. Good hiring practices. Make sure the people you hire are people that you want working for you. One time I was complaining to an HR manager about an employee, and he said, "Frank, don't complain to me. Did you hire the person?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, you hired the problem. So you hire your problems. Somewhere you hired the problem." So be very careful in your hiring practices and vet your employee applications very closely. If unethical behavior is occurring, quite often it will come about in a change in lifestyle or in the behavior of the individual. In my experience, and I've seen a number of different fraudulent transactions occur, particularly on the part of employees, or even in management, and normally there's a change in lifestyle or behavior. If Leroy shows up some Monday morning with a new Corvette, you might ask about it. And his answer might be, "Oh yeah, my Aunt Mildred died and left me $100,000 and I always wanted a Corvette and so I bought the Corvette." This may be the truth. Or it may be that the company bought the Corvette through funds that Leroy had stolen. Or you'll find an employee take cruises, or their lifestyle seems to have increased. Behavioral changes. Quite often, if a person is involved in unethical behavior, their way in which they act will change. They might become confrontational, edgy. They might be withdrawn. Something changes. And when you see that, you need to be aware that something strange may happen, and you need to sit down and talk to the individual about it. The same with the change in lifestyle. Don't be afraid of, on a very friendly basis without being confrontational, try to find out more about Aunt Mildred, so forth. People steal for some reason. Normally they steal because they have a habit, either alcohol, gambling, or women. I've never seen a woman steal to support another man, but I've seen men steal to support a mistress. So there is a reason why people are stealing. Sometimes it could be that they have a serious health problem, medical situation in their family. That does occur too. But you need to be aware of it. In other words, sit people down and learn about your individual employees. So watch for a change in lifestyle, watch for a big change in behavior. That's the best sign that something is happening. Encourage ethical behavior. It sounds pretty simple, but in other words, again, encourage it. Talk about it. Talk about what is ethical. And in a minute I will go over a test that you should give your individual employees to use. And one of the most important things you can do is vacations. Enforce vacations. Have a take or lose policy on vacation. Get the people out of the office for a definite period of time. Don't let someone take their vacation a day at a time. Require that they take it at least a week at a time if they have a week's vacation. And even if they have 2 weeks, I would encourage them to take 2 weeks at a time. If they are participating in some type of a fraudulent activity and they're away from their desk for a week, something will surface. Think of the lapping situation. If they're not there to answer the phone call when the customer calls up and says, "What's wrong with the posting on my account?" then somebody else will, and they may investigate it, and the lapping scheme will totally come unfolded. Or if they're putting bonus people on the payroll, that may come to light. So enforce vacations. Make people take vacations. Not all unethical behavior is easy to see or understand. So when you suspect something and you want to approach an individual or you want to try to solve a particular problem that you think is occurring, make sure you have all the facts. Do it on an unbiased basis. Do not come to a conclusion before you have the facts. And then sit down and define your alternatives and choices. How can I handle this? Do I want to have somebody else involved? Do I want to take the individual to lunch? Or do I want to have them in a closed-door conference? Then look at the rules as they apply to the unethical behavior that you think is occurring. Have they actually broken a rule? Then you may step back and say, I don't know if this is unethical behavior or not, so why do I feel pressured? What is it about this individual's behavior or lifestyle or my suspicions that are pressuring me? And the way the pros and cons of what may happen, what may be the outcome of the situation once you confront the individual. So you may choose to meet face to face with the person, okay? All right. Sit down, talk to them about it, lay out what you think. Or you may contact human resources or somebody that handles the ethics for your company and turn the facts over to them and then let them pursue it. That takes you out of the circle. It may be so serious that you will want to contact and discuss the possible situation with outside legal counsel. So get their advice on how you should proceed. So you'll put yourself in a jeopardy of where you possibly will end up being sued by the employee themselves. Or you may just do nothing. You may come to the conclusion, hey, this is all smoke and mirrors in my mind. I like the Texas Instruments ethics question. This is something that when you're looking at making a decision or taking some action, you should sit down and run through. And I would post this, I would give this to individuals, your subordinates, and say, you know, sometimes we have a question as to what we're doing is ethical, or what somebody else is asking us to do ethical. If you're concerned, just sit down and run through this little mental exercise. What is the legal action? Is it really legal? Does it comply with my values? It may be legal, but it may go against my values. I may not feel good about making this decision. In other words, will I feel bad? Would I want my family to know that I'm making this decision? How would I look in their eyes? How would they judge me if they knew I was making this decision? How would it look in the newspapers? Would I want this action to appear on Monday morning in the newspaper, that this occurred, that I'm being accused of doing something that may or may not be legal? If it's in the newspapers, your name's going to be out there, whether you are guilty or not. If it's wrong, just don't do it. That's an easy solution. Don't do it. This may cost you your job in the long run, but you have to say, would I rather be looking for a new job and still have my personal values and live with myself? This is a tough decision, and this faces it many, many times in our career. You'll be pressured to do something you know is wrong. You're going to suffer in the long run. You have to make the decision. You may even want to ask somebody, your manager or a peer or somebody else, what does this look like to you? Does it look like it's legal or is it ethical? And what would you think? How would you judge this if I took this action? Very good little list. The last thing I want to talk about is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I have asked you in your homework to write a paper on one of 4 or 5 different large corporate frauds that occurred in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003. These frauds resulted in massive financial losses to individuals. Managers went to jail. Some people didn't go to jail that probably should have. Congress, investors became concerned about what was going on with management and the independent auditors. In other words, why were auditors giving clean opinions and then we find that the earnings have to be restated at some future date or the company becomes insolvent? So Sarbanes-Oxley put in place a provision passed by Congress that independent auditors had to certify that they had examined and looked at the adequacy of the internal controls. It's a separate certification, which means they have to go in and audit those controls and say, okay, you do have good internal controls or you don't. Management then also has to certify that there's no misstatement in the financial information. Now in the past, and in many of the cases you're going to look at, management took the fall because some subordinate pointed at them and said, that individual told me to do this. My boss told me to do this. Now, many managers in companies are asking each one of their subordinates to also sign off that they don't know of any fraud or misstatement. So there no longer can be any finger pointing. So I can no longer say, oh, my boss told me to do it, because I signed a statement that said, I know of no misstatement. I know of no fraud. Another provision is the rotation of audit partners. Audit partners got real chummy with their chief financial officer or controller. A good example was Enron. And they got a position where they lost their good judgment, either because they were too close to the audit of the firm or they were concerned about losing the audit for financial purposes or something else. So now it's required that the audit partner be rotated on a 5-year basis. I almost think this is too long. I would like to see rotation be on a 2-year basis. It's interesting to note that back to the 1920s, General Motors Corporation always required their auditors to rotate partners on at least a 5-year basis. Askin Sells was their audit firm, now known as Deloitte, and they were rotating audit partners back in the 20s. There's a very strong whistleblower protection. So if you are a subordinate and you blow a whistle, you are protected by a federal law that you cannot be discharged, you cannot have management come and retaliate against you in any way for what you did. Now, if you're going to blow a whistle, you better be pretty sure that you know what you're talking about. But if you are positive, then you now know that you're protected. And you also see in these cases that I've assigned out where we had some whistleblowers that took some pretty hard falls because they did the right thing. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley applies only to publicly traded companies. So if it's a private company, Sarbanes-Oxley does not apply. However, I know of many private companies where they have implemented the provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley just to show that they are trying to do the right thing, that they want to make sure there's no fraud occurring in their company. So that ends the module number 7.